At 190 miles an hour with the championship of the entire season riding on the next 90 seconds. Damon Price felt his brake pedal sink all the way to the floor and touched nothing. No resistance, no car, just a 2-ton machine hurtling toward a concrete wall at the end of the longest straight in the sport, and a voice in his headset, his own engineer's voice, screaming at him to do the one thing that should have been impossible. Damon had two choices in that instant lift coast and hand the title to the man who had spent all year trying to destroy him, or trust the woman on the other end of that radio with his life. What he chose in that half second, and why he chose it, is a story about sabotage and betrayal and a quiet, stubborn love that nobody in that whole paddock ever saw coming until the day it saved his life. Stay with me all the way to the end, and hit that subscribe button right now, because the truth about what happened to that brake pedal is going to make your blood run absolutely cold. To understand how Damon Price ended up flat out toward a wall with no brakes, you have to go back to the beginning, to a boy in a grease-stained garage in Gary, Indiana. Damon's father ran a 2-bay auto shop, the kind of place that kept the whole neighborhood's cars running on prayers and second-hand parts, where folks paid what they could and sometimes paid in favors, and where a boy could learn more about how the world actually works than any classroom ever taught. Damon grew up under the hood before he could reach the pedals, handing his father wrenches, listening to the old man diagnose an engine by ear, the way a doctor listens to a chest. He had a gift that mechanics recognized before anyone put him in a race car. He could feel a machine. He could hear a bearing about to fail 3 days before it failed. He could tell you by the vibration through the steering column exactly what a car needed. When he finally started racing go-karts first on a bald track outside town in a cart his father built from junkyard pieces, the other kids had money and coaching and factory rides, and Damon had a homemade cart and a feel for the machine that none of them could buy. He learned young what it was to be the outsider at the track, the whispers, when he unloaded a cart that had been welded together in a 2-bay shop, the assumption that he didn't belong, the small cruelties of a sport that ran on family money and old connections. He learned to answer all of it, the only way that ever shut it up, which was to win, and then to win again, and to say nothing while he did it. His father taught him that too. "You don't argue with the ones who count you out," the old man said, tightening a wheel nut. "You just be so good they run out of ways to explain it." Damon carried that into every level of the sport, and it was still the truest thing he knew on the day, years later, when a billionaire decided that a black kid from a garage had gotten too good to be allowed to keep winning. He beat them anyway. He kept beating them all the way up the ladder through every level of the sport that tried to price him out, until at 28, Damon Price was one of the 2 fastest drivers in American open-wheel racing, and according to everyone who knew the sport, the most naturally gifted driver to come along in a generation. But racing is not only about talent. Racing is about money and machinery and politics, and the man who controlled a great deal of all three in that series was named Victor Straley. Straley owned the sport's most powerful team, the Straley Racing Juggernaut, a fortune inherited, and multiplied a fleet of cars and a wall of championships and a private jet with the team logo on the tail. He also sat on the series competition committee, which meant that the man who owned the biggest team also had a hand in writing and enforcing the rules that governed everyone else's. For years, this had worked out beautifully for Victor Straley. His cars won because they were the best funded, and when they didn't win, the politics tended to bend his way, and no one had ever seriously challenged the arrangement because no one outside his own machine had ever been fast enough to matter. Meridian Racing was held together by 2 people and a prayer. The first was Hank Boone, the team owner, a leathery former mechanic in his 60s who had mortgaged his house twice to keep the team alive, who had seen every kind of talent come through the sport and swore that Damon Price was the realest he'd ever put in a seat. Hank had signed Damon when no one else would touch him back, when the Whisper campaign hadn't started yet, but the money still wasn't there, and he'd done it on a handshake and a look in the kid's eyes. "I don't have Straley's money," Hank told him the day he signed. "I can't give you the best car, but I can give you an honest one, and I can promise you that every point you score, you'll have earned, and nobody will ever be able to take that away from you." The second was an old mechanic named Reuben, who had wrenched in the sport for 40 years, and whose hands were as sensitive as Damon's, and who treated the young driver's car like his own child. Reuben was the one who later would confirm what Emma's data showed, because Reuben knew that car down to the last bolt. And Reuben knew the instant he saw the failed line that no part he had touched had ever failed like that. These were the people betting their livelihoods on Damon, an old owner who'd mortgaged his house, an old mechanic who checked every bolt himself. When Damon thought about quitting under the weight of Straley's campaign, it was their faces that stopped him. He was not the only one who would lose if he lost. Then Damon Price signed with a small, underfunded independent team called Meridian Racing and started winning races he had no business winning in a car that cost a fraction of Straley's on pure talent and feel. And Victor Straley, watching a black kid from a Gary garage embarrass his $100 million operation weekend after weekend, decided that Damon Price was a problem that needed to be solved. At first, Straley tried to buy him the way powerful men always try to buy the thing that threatens them. He offered Damon a seat on Straley Racing, more money than Damon had ever imagined, a factory car, everything. But the offer came with a leash. Damon would be the number 2 driver contractually required to yield to Straley's golden boy, a smooth, well-connected driver named Chase Ellison, who had all the sponsorship and half the talent. Damon understood exactly what he was being offered, not a chance to win, a chance to be owned and to make Straley's chosen champion look good. He said no. And Victor Straley, who had never in his life been told no by a man with no money, decided that if he could not own Damon Price, he would destroy him. The campaign that followed was a season long and utterly ruthless. It started with the rules. The competition committee, at Straley's quiet urging, introduced a series of technical regulations that seemed neutral on paper, but were designed with surgical precision to hurt small teams and help big ones. Expensive mandatory components, tightened tolerances that required equipment. Only a factory team could afford a testing schedule that favored teams with unlimited budgets. Meridian scraped and borrowed to keep up. Then came the protests after nearly every race Damon won. Straley's team filed a technical protest against Meridian's car, forcing the small team to spend money and days it didn't have defending itself before officials, some of whom owed their positions to Victor Straley. Most of the protests were dismissed, but the process itself was the punishment, a slow bleeding of a team that had no blood to spare. And then came the whispers, which were the worst, because they went after the one thing Damon had that money couldn't touch: his name. A story began to circulate that Meridian's car was illegal, that Damon Price was only winning because his team was cheating, running some hidden trick, and that it was only a matter of time before he was caught. There was no evidence, because there was no trick. Damon was winning on talent. But a whisper doesn't need evidence, it only needs repetition, and Straley had a whole paddock full of people willing to repeat it. Sponsors who hate controversy grew nervous. A backer Meridian had been counting on pulled out. There was a race at the middle of the season that nearly ended everything, and not by accident. At a fast, narrow street circuit running second and closing on Ellison, Damon was squeezed into a wall by a Straley car. Not Ellison's, but the team's second entry, driven by a journeyman whose whole job that weekend seemed to be making Damon Price's afternoon end early. The contact sent Damon hard into the barrier at a speed that bent the car in half and left him in the medical center for 3 hours with a concussion and a wrist that would ache for the rest of the season. The move was ruled a racing incident. Of course it was. But Emma pulled the data afterward and showed Hank the other driver's line. The deliberate turn in the throttle held exactly where it needed to be to make an accident look like hard racing. And the 3 of them sat in the garage that night and understood fully for the first time that this was no longer about points. Straley was willing to see Damon hurt, maybe worse than hurt. Damon, his wrist wrapped and his head still ringing, said the thing that defined him. Then we don't give him the satisfaction of scaring us off. We race. We just race smarter, and we start writing down everything. It was Emma who started the file that night, the file that would months later put Victor Straley in a courtroom. She started it because a man she was falling for had refused to be frightened, and she decided that if he wouldn't quit, she would make sure that when the moment came, they'd have the proof to end it. By mid-season, the fastest driver in the sport was in real danger of losing his ride entirely. Not because he was slow, but because a powerful man had decided to make him toxic. The one thing that kept Meridian alive was a person Victor Straley had made the mistake of underestimating: the team's new race engineer, Emma Caldwell. Emma had come to Meridian at the start of that season, and her arrival had been its own small scandal, because she had walked away from a senior job at, of all places, Straley Racing, to take a pay cut at a struggling independent. She was 30, a brilliant aerodynamicist and data engineer, one of the sharpest technical minds in the paddock, and she had spent 3 years inside Straley's operation, growing quietly disgusted by what she saw there. The way the team leaned on politics as much as engineering, the way Victor Straley treated the sport as his personal property, the casual certainty that the rules were his to bend. The final straw had been overhearing Straley after one of Damon's early wins refer to the young driver in terms so ugly that Emma had gone home, updated her resume, and started looking for the exit. When Meridian Small broke and fielding the most exciting driver in racing offered her the chance to build a car that could beat her old boss on merit, she took it without hesitating. Damon and Emma did not like each other at first. I was intuitive, all feel and instinct. A driver who talked about the car, the way you'd talk about a horse. She was empirical, all data and telemetry, an engineer who wanted numbers, not poetry. Their first months were a running argument. He'd come in from a session and say the car felt nervous on entry and lazy off the throttle. And she'd pull up 40 channels of data and try to make him tell her what that meant in terms she could actually change. He thought she didn't trust his hands. She thought he didn't respect her science. And slowly, over a season of long nights in a cramped garage, each of them discovered that the other was right, that his feel could find problems her data couldn't see, and her data could solve problems his feel couldn't fix, and that together they were building something neither could have built alone. The car got faster. And somewhere in all those long nights, arguing over telemetry traces and eating bad food out of vending machines at 3 in the morning, the argument had turned into something else, though neither of them would have admitted it, because you don't fall for your race engineer and you don't fall for your driver, and both of them had a whole season and $100 million of enemy pressure to think about instead. Straley tried to get Emma back too, or failing that, to neutralize her. 3 weeks before the finale, she received a call from a headhunter, a very good job, a senior technical directorship, more money than she'd ever made, at a team that turned out, when she looked into it, to be quietly funded by Straley interests. It was a bribe dressed as an opportunity. Leave Meridian, leave Damon, and be rewarded. When she declined, the tone changed. There were hints through back channels that a young engineer who made enemies in a small sport might find doors closing, that her reputation could be managed, that she'd be smart to think about her future. Emma had watched Straley do this to people for 3 years. She recognized every move, and instead of frightening her, it did the opposite. It told her that Straley was afraid of what she knew and what she could see in the data. And a frightened, powerful man, she understood, is a powerful man who is about to make a mistake. She told Damon about the call one night in the garage, and he got very quiet, and then he said, "You could take it, the safe job. I'd understand. I wouldn't blame you for a second." And Emma said, "I didn't leave him once to go back to him now, and I didn't stay for the job." It was the closest either of them had come all season to saying the thing out loud. Neither of them finished the sentence, but they both heard it. There was a night weeks before the finale that neither of them ever talked about, but both of them remembered. It was past 3 in the morning, the garage empty, except for the two of them. A telemetry trace frozen on the screen that they'd been arguing about for an hour. Damon insisting the car was doing something in the fast left-hander that the data didn't show. Emma insisting the data showed everything and he was chasing a ghost. And then, mid-argument, Emma had gone quiet and rerun the corner at a different resolution. And there it was, a tiny intermittent flex in the rear that only appeared under a very specific load, exactly where Damon's hands had felt it and her instruments had smoothed it away. She stared at it. Then she looked at him. This driver she'd spent months thinking was all instinct and no discipline, and said, "You felt that. Through the seat at 140 you felt something my sensors were averaging out." Damon shrugged, but he was smiling. "And you found it," he said. "I can feel it. I can't see it. You can see it." They looked at each other across the glow of the screen, two people who had just discovered at 3 in the morning that they were each exactly what the other was missing. And for a moment the garage was very quiet and very warm. And then somebody's phone buzzed, and the moment folded itself away, and neither of them reached for it again, and both of them thought about it for a long time after. That was the night, though neither would admit it, that the argument became something else. By the final race of the season, it all came down to a single number, Damon and Chase Ellison Straley's Golden Boy were tied for the championship. Whoever finished ahead of the other in the last race would be champion. Everything. Damon had the season, the vindication, the future of the whole small team that had bet on him came down to one race against a man in a better-funded car owned by the person who had spent all year trying to destroy him. Victor Straley was not willing to leave it to the track. Here's what Emma pieced together later from the data, because the data in the end is what caught them. In the final hours before the race, someone had gotten to Damon's car. Not to the engine, which was inspected and sealed, but to the brake system. A slow, deliberate compromise of a hydraulic line, engineered to hold under normal load and then fail catastrophically under the extreme heat and pressure of hard braking late in a long race when the brakes were at their hottest and the stakes at their highest. It was designed to look like a failure. A tragic, plausible mechanical failure, the kind that happens in racing, the kind no one would ever prove was anything but bad luck. A small team, everyone would say. Underfunded, they cut a corner and their driver paid for it. And Victor Straley's Golden Boy would take the championship, and the dangerous black kid from Gary would be at best out of the sport, and at worst, Emma caught it. Barely. In the final systems check before the race, poring over the data. The way she always did, she saw an anomaly in the brake line pressure, a tiny fluctuation. Well within tolerance, the kind of thing 99 engineers out of 100 would have ignored. But Emma was the 100th, and she had spent 3 years learning how things went wrong inside Straley's world, and something about that flicker made the hair on her arms stand up. There wasn't time to strip and rebuild the entire brake system before the race. If she pulled the car, Damon forfeited the championship, and she had a flicker in a data channel and no proof. She made a decision that she would carry for the rest of her life. She told Damon. She told him everything in the garage 20 minutes before the green flag. The anomaly, her fear, her certainty, and her lack of proof. She told him she thought his brakes were going to fail. Probably late, probably at the worst possible moment, and that she couldn't prove it and couldn't fix it in time. And that the safe thing, the only sane thing, was to withdraw and hand Straley the title and live to fight another year. Damon looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Can you see it coming on the data? If it's going to fail, can you see it building before it goes?" Emma understood what he was asking, and it terrified her. "Maybe," she said. "The pressure signature, if it starts to go, I might see it a few seconds before you feel it." Maybe. But Damon, a few seconds at that speed. "Then you're my brakes," Damon said. "You watch the data. If you see it going, you tell me and I'll trust you. I'll lift when you say lift. I'll do whatever you say exactly when you say it. I've trusted my hands my whole life. I'm going to trust you." He picked up his helmet. "He spent a whole year trying to make everyone believe I only win because I cheat. I'm not going to hand him the championship by quitting. We win this straight on the track or we go down proving what he did. But we don't quit." Emma wanted to argue. She wanted to grab him and drag him out of the car. Instead, she looked at the man she had spent a season falling for, and she understood that his refusing to quit was the exact thing she'd fallen for, and she made the hardest choice of her career. "Okay," she said. "Then get in, and Damon, do exactly what I say, not a fraction of a second late." Before the green flag in the last quiet minute in the garage, Hank Boone put his hand on the roll hoop and looked at his driver. "Kid," the old man said, "I mortgaged my house twice for this team, and I'd do it a third time. And none of it, you hear me, none of it is worth you not coming home tonight. If it feels wrong out there, you bring it in. There's no trophy worth it." Damon looked at the man who'd bet everything on him when no one else would. "I know, Hank," he said. "That's why I'm going to listen to Emma. She won't let me do anything stupid." Reuben, wiping his hands on a rag he'd been wiping them on for 40 years, said only, "I checked every bolt on this car myself. Every one. Whatever happens out there, it wasn't us." He didn't know yet how important those words would turn out to be. Emma pulled on her headset. Damon pulled down his visor. And a car that a woman believed was trying to kill its driver rolled out onto the grid for the most important race of all their lives. The race was the greatest anyone in that sport had ever seen, though most of the people watching didn't understand why until afterward. For 2 hours, Damon Price drove a car. he had been told was trying to kill him, and he drove it flat out wheel to wheel with Chase Ellison, and every few laps Emma's voice came over the radio. Pressure holding, and Damon believed her and drove harder. He led, then lost the lead, then took it back with a pass around the outside of a corner that no one thought was physically possible. There were moments that would be replayed for years. A restart 40 laps in, where Ellison tried to force Damon wide into the marbles, and Damon simply refused to be moved, holding the racing line by inches with a car he was nursing through every braking zone because Emma had told him to keep temperatures down, to be gentle with the very system that was plotting against him. A rain shower that swept the circuit at half distance and turned the track into glass where Damon's feel the gift, that money couldn't buy the gift he'd been born with in a garage in Gary, let him find grip that the telemetry insisted wasn't there, and he pulled out a 4-second lead in conditions that had half the field spinning into the runoff. And all through it, the two voices in his ear. Emma calm, feeding him pressures and temperatures, and the discipline that kept him alive, and under it the whole season. The wall he'd been put into, the whispers, the rules written to break him, the old man who'd mortgaged his house, the old mechanic who checked every bolt. Damon drove for all of it. He drove the race of his life in a car he'd been told was a coffin, and he kept it on the road, and he kept it fast, and he trusted the woman on the radio with every corner. And behind the pit wall, Emma Caldwell watched 40 channels of data with an intensity that felt like holding her breath for 2 hours, waiting for the one flicker that would mean her driver's life was measured in seconds. It came on the last lap. Of course it came on the last lap. Damon was leading Ellison by half a second, the two of them screaming down the longest straight on the circuit toward the final braking zone, 190 miles an hour into a corner that demanded he shed 100 of them in a few hundred feet, and in Emma's data, the pressure signature that had held for 2 hours suddenly sickeningly began to fall. She saw the failure building in real time, 3 seconds before Damon would reach the corner, and she keyed the radio and did the bravest thing she had ever done, which was to stay calm. "Damon, brakes are going. Do not touch the pedal. Downshift now. All of it. 3rd-second drag, the gears use the runoff, put 2 wheels on the grass on exit. Now, Damon. Now." And Damon Price at 190 miles an hour with the championship of the entire season. Riding on the next 90 seconds felt his brake pedal sink all the way to the floor and touched nothing. Exactly as she'd said it would, and did not lift in panic, did not stab the dead pedal, did not do any of the things instinct screamed at him to do. He did exactly what the woman on the radio told him. He came down through the gears so hard, the whole car howled in protest, the revs screaming past the red line, the transmission and the engine themselves doing the work. The brakes could no longer do, scrubbing off 10, 20, 30 miles an hour in a heartbeat. The rear stepped out. Of course, it did a car shedding that much speed without brakes wants to spin, and here is where a lifetime in a Gary garage saved his life, because Damon caught it before it was even fully a slide, a flick of opposite lock so fast and so instinctive that the television cameras almost missed it, the correction of a man whose hands had been talking to machines since before he could see over the dashboard. He ran the car deep and wide, using every inch of the escape road and the run off the tires kicking up a rooster tail of dust and gravel. He put 2 wheels onto the grass on the exit and gathered the whole sliding, howling, brakeless mess of it back up with a delicacy that engineers would study frame by frame for years. And he brought a car with no brakes through the final corner of the championship, slower than he wanted, losing the lead to Ellison in the process, but through it, upright, on the road. Alive exactly because he had trusted a voice more than his own fear. Alive, on the track, still racing. He crossed the line second. Chase Ellison won the race, and with it on the road the championship. Damon coasted the dead car down the pit lane on the engine alone, unable to stop it properly, and when it finally rolled to a halt against the tire barrier at the end, he sat in the cockpit for a moment with his hands shaking, and then he climbed out, and the first thing he did before the cameras, before the officials, before anything, was walk straight to the pit wall and put his forehead against Emma's. The two of them not saying a word. Both of them understanding that she had just kept him alive with her voice and 40 channels of data and a nerve he would never stop being astonished by. Reuben got to the car and put his hand on the front wing where the brake ducts were, and his face changed, and he called Hank over, and the 2 old men looked at what the car was telling them, and then they looked at each other, and Hank Boone, who had lost the championship 11 minutes earlier, said in a voice like gravel, That's not a failure. Get the officials. Get them now, and don't let anybody near this car. For about 11 minutes, Victor Straley had gotten exactly what he wanted. And then Emma Caldwell walked into the officials' room with 2 hours of telemetry data and a brake system that told to any engineer who read it a story that could not be explained by bad luck. The failure signature was not the signature of a worn part or a manufacturing flaw. It was the signature of a line that had been deliberately compromised, weakened in a specific place in a specific way, to fail under specific conditions. And Emma, who had spent 3 years inside Straley's operation, knew exactly what she was looking at and knew how to explain it, so that even non-engineers could understand it, and had the credibility of a top engineer who had once worked for the accused. She had preserved the failed components. She had the data. And she had one more thing. The thing that turned suspicion into proof, the garage's own security and timing logs, which she'd had the presence of mind to pull, showing that in the pre-race window, a member of Straley's team, not a Meridian employee, a Straley employee with no legitimate reason to be there, had been recorded near Damon's car. Rubin was the one who made the technical case airtight. When the officials wanted to argue that the line might simply have failed, that Meridian, the underfunded team, had cut a corner. It was the 40-year mechanic who stood up in that room, laid the failed component on the table, and walked them through it, bolt by bolt, part by part, showing them the difference between a part that fails and a part that is made to fail. "I built this car," Rubin said. "I know every inch of it like I know my own hands. This line did not wear out. This line was killed. And it was killed by somebody who knew exactly where to cut so it'd hold long enough to look like an accident." Coming from Emma, a former Straley engineer, and Rubin, a lifer, whose honesty no one in the paddock had ever questioned, the testimony was impossible to wave away. And when they laid the timing logs beside it, the Straley technician near Damon's car in a window, he had no business being in the room, went silent, and everyone in it understood that they were no longer looking at a racing dispute. The investigation that followed tore the sport apart and then remade it. The Straley technician, faced with the evidence and facing criminal charges for what was not a racing infraction but attempted murder, did what small men do when the powerful man who ordered them into danger is nowhere to be found. He talked. He named Victor Straley. He described the instruction, the plan, the intent, and the whole rotten architecture that Straley had built over a decade, the rigged rules, the weaponized protests, the officials in his pocket, the whisper campaign, all of it. Once investigators started pulling, came apart in a cascade. Victor Straley was banned from the sport for life. His seat on the competition committee was not merely vacated, but abolished, the conflict of interest. It represented finally too visible to survive. Criminal charges followed him out of racing and into a courtroom where a jury did what juries do when a rich man is shown to have tried to kill a working man over a trophy. Straley sat through that trial with the disbelief of a man who had never once in 60 years been made to answer for anything, and who could not quite comprehend that his money had run out of doors to close. The technician testified. Emma testified, precise and unshakable, walking the jury through the data the way she'd once walked Damon through a corner. Rubin testified, 40 years of honest hands behind every word. And when the verdict came, the man who had treated an entire sport as his private property was led out of the courtroom to begin paying at last for the one thing his fortune could not make disappear. Hank Boone was in the gallery for the verdict. The old owner who'd mortgaged his house twice, who'd lost the championship on the road and then watched it be revealed as a crime, sat very still as the words were read. And then he put his weathered face in his weathered hands, not out of grief, but out of the relief of a man who has finally seen the world set right after betting everything that it could be. Chase Ellison, who it turned out had known nothing of the sabotage and was genuinely sickened by it, quietly relinquished the tainted championship, and in a gesture that surprised everyone publicly acknowledged that the fastest driver in the sport had beaten him all year on merit. The series, its credibility in ruins, awarded no champion that season, but everyone in racing knew and said out loud that the real champion was the man who had brought a sabotaged car through the final corner with no brakes and lived, and then exposed the man who'd done it. There was a moment in the hours after the race that Damon would never forget. Victor Straley, who had come to the finale expecting a coronation, made the mistake of trying to leave the circuit before the officials sealed his cars, and Damon, still in his fireproofs, still smelling of the brakes that had tried to kill him, walked out to the Straley motorhome and stood in the man's path. He didn't shout. He didn't raise a hand. He just looked at the billionaire who had spent a year and a great deal of money trying to end him and said quietly, "You spent all year telling everybody I only win because I cheat, and the whole time the only person in this paddock who ever actually cheated was you. You tried to buy me, you tried to scare me, you put me in a wall, and tonight you tried to kill me, and it still wasn't enough because you never understood the one thing my father taught me when I was 6 years old." Straley, for once in his life, had nothing to say. "You be so good," Damon said, "that they run out of ways to explain it. I'm done being explained, Victor. Now everybody's going to know exactly what you are." He walked away, and behind him the officials arrived to seal the cars, and Victor Straley's empire began in that instant to come apart. The following season, with the rigged rules torn up and the sport rebuilt around fairness, Damon Price won the championship on the track cleanly, undeniably, and there was not one whisper anywhere in the paddock that he had done it anyway, but the hardest and most honest way there is. The kid from the Gary garage stood on the top step with the trophy his father had built him toward one junkyard cart at a time, and there was not a person in that grandstand who did not understand exactly what it had cost him to get there. His father was there to see it. The old man who'd built a cart out of junkyard pieces stood in the crowd in his good shirt and watched his son lift the championship, and when Damon found him afterward, neither of them could talk for a while. Hank Boone's team, the little independent that had mortgaged everything and been proven right, became the story of the season, and sponsors who had once fled the Whisper campaign now lined up to be associated with the most honest team in racing. Ruben got to retire finally on his own terms, and spent his last race weekend being toasted by every mechanic in the paddock, because a lifer whose honest word had helped bring down Victor Straley was a lifer they would tell stories about long after he was gone. And Emma, the night of the sabotage race, the night she had talked the man she loved through a corner that should have killed him, and then walked into a room and brought down an empire. Damon found her behind the garage, shaking the adrenaline finally crashing out of her, and he did the thing they had both been not doing all season. He held her, and when she'd stopped shaking, he said, "I put my life in your hands today. On the last lap at 190, I put my whole life in your hands, and I didn't hesitate, and you want to know why?" She looked up at him. "Because somewhere in all those 3 a.m. arguments about telemetry, you became the person I trust more than my own hands, and I've never trusted anything more than my own hands in my life." Emma, who dealt in numbers and not poetry, found that she had no data for what she was feeling. "You know I could have been wrong," she said, her voice still unsteady. "The whole race. If I'd read that pressure signature wrong, if I'd called it a second late, I'd have—" Damon put his hand against the side of her face. "You weren't wrong," he said. "You're never wrong about the machine. That's the whole point. I bet my life on that being true, and it was true." And Emma understood, standing there, that he had not just trusted her skill. He had trusted her completely, in a way no one had ever trusted her, and that she had spent a whole season pretending she didn't want exactly that. So she stopped pretending. She just kissed him there behind the garage with the failed brake components still sitting in an evidence bag 20 feet away, and the whole future of the sport about to change. And it was, she would say later, the only decision she'd ever made without needing the numbers first, and the only one she never once double-checked. They were together after that openly, and the paddock that had once whispered that Damon Price only won by cheating now watched the two of them build the most formidable driver and engineer partnership the sport had seen in a generation. She engineered the cars, he drove them, and the trophies they won together, they won clean. They married 2 seasons later in the off-season at Damon's father's shop in Gary. The old man insisted, said no fancy venue would do. Said his boy got married where his boy learned to feel a machine. They cleared the 2 bays, rolled the lifts back, and strung lights across the rafters where oil change coupons had hung for 30 years, and the whole neighborhood that had kept its cars running on prayers and second-hand parts crowded in to watch the kid who'd built a cart out of junk marry the brilliant woman who'd once been his enemy's engineer. Hank Boone gave a speech and got about 4 words in before he had to stop and collect himself. Ruben walked Emma partway down the makeshift aisle because she'd asked him to, and the old mechanic's hands, which had felt every bolt on the car that nearly killed her driver, shook worse doing that than they ever had under a hood. And Damon's father stood up at the end, the man who'd taught his son to hear a bearing fail 3 days early, and raised a glass and said the truest thing anyone said all night. I taught that boy how to feel a machine, took a woman with a computer to teach him how to trust something outside his own 2 hands. Between the 2 of you, I figure you'll be just fine. Emma, who dealt in numbers and not poetry, cried anyway. She had over 1 long season become the exception to her own rule, the one thing in her life she'd chosen without the data and gotten right. If this story got your heart pounding, do Damon a favor, smash that subscribe button, drop a comment telling me whether you'd have had the nerve to keep your foot in it with no brakes and a voice on the radio, and share this with somebody who needs to be reminded that the people who cheat and bully and buy their way to the top are only powerful right up until the moment one honest person with the truth in her hands decides to stand up and walk into the room. We've got more of these coming. Good people, the powerful, tried to break each one with a villain who was certain his money made him untouchable, and each one with the exact moment it all comes roaring back around on him, and you will not want to miss a single one of them. Tell me in the comments at 190 miles an hour with a dead pedal under your foot and a voice in your ear. Could you have kept from lifting? I honestly don't know if I could have. I'll see you in the very next one.